The last thing Callum Reed expected to give away was the only meal he and his daughter had left. He had spent the morning counting coins beside an overdue electricity notice, calculating whether a loaf of bread could stretch a little further, and pretending not to notice when 8-year-old Maisie said she wasn't hungry. Yet when he saw a tired woman sitting alone outside the neighborhood grocery store, dressed in a faded coat and staring at the ground as if the world had forgotten her, Callum broke his sandwich in half. He handed her the larger piece before he even knew her name. What he didn't know was that the woman accepting his last meal wasn't homeless, unemployed, or abandoned. She was Sloane Whitaker, the powerful chief executive of a billion-dollar company, and she had disguised herself as poor for a day to answer a question money had never been able to solve: whether kindness still existed when nobody was watching. If you believe in kindness, compassion, and second chances, stories like this remind us that even the smallest act of generosity can become the beginning of someone's greatest turning point. Callum hadn't always lived one unpaid bill away from disaster. He had once worked as a maintenance supervisor at a large manufacturing warehouse, earning enough to pay rent, keep food in the refrigerator, and take Maisie to the park on quiet afternoons. His wife, Lenora, had died after a sudden illness when Maisie was only 5, leaving Callum to become both father and mother while carrying a grief he rarely let anyone see. He learned to braid hair by watching videos. He packed school lunches with handwritten notes, even when the lunches held little more than crackers and sliced apples. He sat beside Maisie whenever storms frightened her and told her that courage didn't mean being unafraid. It meant staying gentle even when life had given you reasons to become hard. For a while he managed. Then the warehouse changed ownership. Hundreds of positions were cut, and Callum was let go with little warning. Since then he had taken whatever temporary work he could find, repairing fences, unloading trucks, cleaning offices, fixing appliances for neighbors who sometimes paid him with groceries instead of money. Callum left their small apartment beneath a pale blue sky and walked Maisie to school. The heat hadn't yet arrived, and sunlight moved gently through the trees, turning the sidewalks gold. Maisie wore a backpack with a broken zipper and shoes that were slightly too small, though she never complained. At the gate, she hugged him tightly and reminded him that her class was having a family lunch soon. Every child was supposed to bring a parent and something homemade. Callum smiled and promised he'd be there. He didn't tell her he had a job interview scheduled for the same time, or that missing it could cost him the only real opportunity he'd seen in a long while. He also didn't tell her there was almost no food at home to prepare for the lunch. He simply watched her disappear into the school building, then turned toward the center of town with a folder of resumes tucked under his arm and hope wearing thin in his chest. Across the city, Sloane Whitaker stood before a wall of glass high above the streets, looking down at people who appeared as small as moving dots. She was one of the most respected executives in the country. Business magazines praised her discipline. Investors admired her decisions. Employees feared disappointing her. She lived in a silent penthouse, traveled in chauffeured cars, and owned more than she had time to use. Yet success had gradually surrounded her with people who agreed with everything she said and praised everything she did. She had launched a company program to support struggling families, but an internal report revealed that most of the money had disappeared into administration, executive events, and glossy advertising. The families featured in the promotional videos had received little lasting help. When Sloane confronted her leadership team, they offered polished explanations and carefully prepared charts. None of them seemed ashamed. The report disturbed her more than she admitted. Her own mother had once cleaned hotel rooms and skipped meals so Sloane could go to school with a full stomach. Sloane remembered standing in food lines as a child, wearing donated clothes, pretending not to hear classmates whispering about her. She had built her company partly to escape that helplessness. But somewhere along the way, she had begun treating poverty as a line on a spreadsheet instead of a condition that shaped real lives. Her assistant, Priya Mercer, suggested she visit one of the neighborhoods the charity program claimed to serve. Sloane refused the cameras, the security officers, the company car. Instead, she borrowed old clothes, left her jewelry behind, put a few dollars in her pocket, and took a bus across town alone. She wanted to see how people treated someone who appeared to have nothing to offer them. The day began badly. At a cafe, customers avoided looking at her. A manager asked her to leave after she lingered too long over the menu without ordering. Outside an office building, a receptionist refused to let her use the restroom. People walked past while she stood at a bus stop pretending to be lost. One man dropped a coin near her shoes without meeting her eyes, then walked on as though generosity meant never having to see the person receiving it. By the middle of the day, Sloane felt embarrassed by how much the treatment had affected her. She knew she could end the experiment whenever she wished. A single phone call would bring a car, fresh clothes, a private lunch. Real poverty offered no such escape. That thought stayed with her as she walked toward a modest grocery store at the edge of the neighborhood. Callum arrived at the same store not long after. His morning had produced 2 rejections and 1 vague promise that someone might call later. He'd spent his last few dollars on a discounted loaf of bread, a small jar of peanut butter, and a bruised banana. Sitting on a bench outside, he made 2 sandwiches with a plastic knife the cashier had given him. One for himself, one for Maisie after school. He wrapped hers carefully in a napkin and tucked it into his worn backpack. Then he noticed Sloane sitting a few feet away. She looked exhausted. Her hair was tied back without care, her coat too heavy for the mild weather, and there was a strange emptiness in her expression. Callum had seen that look before, in mirrors, during the months after Lenora died. The look of someone trying to stay invisible because being noticed might let the pain spill out. He watched her glance at his sandwich and looked quickly away. Without thinking too long, Callum stood, walked over, and offered her half. Sloane hesitated. She had expected indifference, maybe pity, but not generosity from a man whose own clothes were worn at the cuffs. She asked if he was sure. He said food tasted better when it was shared. When she still refused, he smiled and told her his daughter said the same thing whenever she wanted half of his dessert. The mention of Maisie softened his face, and Sloane noticed the second sandwich still in his open backpack. As they ate, Sloane asked why he'd feed a stranger when he clearly didn't have much himself. Callum shrugged and said having little was exactly why he understood hunger. After his wife died, he told her, neighbors had brought meals for a while. Then everyone returned to their own lives. He didn't resent them, but he remembered the quiet evenings afterward, when there was nobody left to ask if he was managing. A stranger's kindness couldn't solve every problem, he said, but sometimes it gave a person enough strength to get through one more day. Sloane felt ashamed. She had believed she was conducting an experiment on society. Sitting beside Callum, she realized the day was exposing her instead. She had approved charity programs without ever speaking to the people they were meant to help. She had sat through fundraising dinners where a single plate cost more than Callum probably earned in a week. She had praised generosity from stages while employees at the bottom of her own company struggled with rent and childcare. The truth was impossible to ignore. She had spent years building an image of compassion while growing distant from the people whose lives had once resembled her own. Callum asked if she had somewhere safe to go. She almost told him the truth, but something stopped her. Instead, she said she was looking for work and had recently lost her home. The lie tasted bitter, but Callum didn't question it. He pulled one of his resumes from the folder and wrote an address on the back, a local community center that offered meals, employment support, and access to showers. He'd gone there himself after losing his warehouse job. He warned her the building was old and the coffee was terrible, but the people were kind. Then he gave her his bus pass. Sloane stared at it in disbelief. Callum would need that pass to collect Maisie from school and get to another possible job site later. When she pointed this out, he said he could walk. The school wasn't far, and the weather was good. Sloane's throat tightened. She had access to private jets, and a struggling father was preparing to walk across town, so she wouldn't have to. Before she could respond, Callum's phone rang. It was Maisie's school. She'd felt dizzy in class and was waiting in the nurse's office. Callum gathered his things at once, concern replacing every other emotion. Sloane offered to return the bus pass, but he refused and hurried off on foot beneath the bright sun. Sloane stayed on the bench long after he disappeared. The bus pass in her hand felt heavier than any award she'd ever received. She called Priya and asked her to send a car, but she didn't go back to the office. Instead, she went to the community center whose address Callum had written down. There she met parents searching for work while their children colored at folding tables. She spoke with elderly people choosing between medication and groceries. She met former Whitaker Global employees who'd lost their positions in a restructuring and never received the support promised in their exit packages. She listened without introducing herself, each story stripping away another layer of the comfortable distance she'd built between corporate decisions and human consequences. Callum reached Maisie's school breathless and soaked with sweat. The nurse explained that Maisie had skipped breakfast and eaten only a few bites at lunch. His face tightened with guilt. Maisie insisted she was fine, but when he opened his backpack for the sandwich, he found the wrapper torn and the food crushed beneath his folder. He apologized again and again. Maisie looked at the ruined sandwich, then at her father's exhausted face, and hugged him. She told him she knew he was trying. That simple sentence nearly broke him. They walked home slowly, stopping under trees whenever Maisie got tired. Callum carried her backpack and told silly stories to keep her spirits up. When they reached their building, the landlord was waiting near the entrance with another notice. Callum had a handful of days to pay the remaining rent or leave. He folded the notice before Maisie could read it and slid it into his pocket. Callum went to an interview for a maintenance position at a luxury hotel. He'd mended his shirt collar with thread and polished his old shoes until the cracks were less visible. The interview was short. The manager seemed distracted and asked whether Callum's responsibilities as a single parent might interfere with weekend shifts. Callum answered honestly that Maisie came first, but that he'd always been reliable. By the time he left, he already knew he wouldn't be hired. Outside, a black car waited at the curb. Priya Mercer stepped out and asked him to come with her. He assumed there'd been some misunderstanding and refused, until she mentioned the woman outside the grocery store. Fear crossed his face. He asked if Sloane was safe. Priya smiled and assured him she was. The car carried him toward Whitaker Global. As it moved through the city, Callum grew increasingly uneasy, wondering whether the woman had been mixed up in something dangerous, whether he'd unknowingly involved himself in trouble, or whether the bus pass had somehow been used to trace him. When he stepped into the company's marble lobby, employees turned to look at his worn clothes. Priya led him to a private elevator and pressed the button for the top floor. Sloane stood waiting in the executive conference room, no longer wearing the faded coat but a tailored navy suit, a panoramic view of the city behind her. Callum stopped in the doorway, confusion giving way to hurt as he understood he'd been deceived. Sloane explained everything: the failed charity program, the disguise, the belief that a single day among struggling people would teach her all she needed to know. She apologized for lying to him and admitted that accepting his food and his bus pass had shown her more about dignity than years of executive leadership ever had. Callum wasn't impressed. He asked whether the whole encounter had been a test, and whether she'd chosen him because he looked poor. Sloane said she hadn't chosen him at all. He was simply the one who noticed her when everyone else looked away. Still, Callum told her that poverty wasn't a costume someone could wear for a day and take off before dinner. He spoke calmly, but the truth in his words cut sharper than anger. Struggling people didn't need to become lessons for the wealthy. They needed fair opportunities, stable wages, affordable childcare, and respect. Sloane listened without defending herself. Then Callum asked the question she'd feared most. What would change once her guilt passed? Sloane walked to the table and placed several documents in front of him. She had already ordered a full suspension of Whitaker Global's charity campaign and opened an independent investigation into how the funds had been used. She'd also approved a new employee assistance program offering emergency rent support, childcare grants, retraining, and direct access to company positions. But she told Callum that policies built without people like him would fail again.